Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy.
Is it time to reimagine your future? The right business skills may make a difference in your career. At Capella University, we offer a relevant education that's designed to focus on what you need to know in the business world. We'll teach professional skills to help you pursue your goals, like business management, strategic planning, and effective communication. And you can apply these skills right away. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from Crump Folk Going Home, written by Constance Holme and published in 1915. This book looks at the lives of the people who live in the village of Westmorland, United Kingdom. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest that you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those new to the podcast, it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community that we have built together. This podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you'll hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. This ad, along with the support from subscribers and patrons, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. A special thanks to everyone who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week. Whether it was through the website or your podcast app, your messages mean the world to me. As I mentioned, my goal is to keep this podcast accessible to everyone. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, there are a few ways you can help out. Follow the podcast in your podcast app and leave a comment. Become a subscriber for $2.99 per month. This also removes the ad at the beginning of the episode and of course supports episode creation. If subscribing is not possible, and I completely understand if it is not, an easy way to help is by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. If you'd like to become a patron or sponsor, please visit boytosleep.com. Whether it's $1 or $5, your monthly contribution helps keep the lights on and the podcast going. It's always great to hear from listeners, and if you'd like to say hello, you can do so by visiting the boytosleep.com website. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. Crump Folk Going Home by Constance Holme. Chapter 1. The curse of the old place was upon it, sudden death. The servants crept quietly, starting when the boards creaked, clutching each other at shadows, and looking for ancestors at every turn. Upstairs, mother and betrothed, doctor and lawyer, convoyed Slinkin Lindsay to his latter end. The butler waited at the door, a curious expression on his face, neither of sorrow nor indifference, possibly the look of one assisting at an interesting experiment. From the library, the only cheerful room at Crump, Christian de Lindsay looked down to the river, and over the arch of the crumbling bridge to the bay. A bitter, snarling wind had edged every hill and headland, and the cold tide came up, hungry and grey. He shivered suddenly. It was a thankless night to go out, where Slinkin Lindsay was going. The evening drew on. A flight of rooks came over the park on the fling of the wind, swept against the windows, sank, rose again, and was gone. And the air wondered, watching them as they swung towards the woods, whether they carried the black soul of Slinkin Lindsay with them. Almost with the thought came the sound of movement overhead, and shortly after, steps on the shallow stairs. When they reached the hall, he recognized them. Nobody but the lawyer walked with one leg and ran with the other. Then came the doctor, less certain of his dignity than usual. After him, the faint, far-off whispering of silk. Lastly, a light, firm step that told nothing. Christian looked longingly at the French window. The lawyer's left leg walked in sedately, but was overrun by the right, which almost rushed into Christian's arms. The left backed promptly, and bumped him into the doctor, but he was too distracted to apologize. He had a sheaf of papers in his hand, which he shuffled continually like a pack of cards. "Your stepbrother has passed away," said the doctor, switching on the light from the door, so that the oak panelling and the windows went black, and Christian's fair head stood out sharply, like a young saint's. He was home barely a couple of hours ago from a long tour abroad, and both doctor and lawyer looked at him curiously, standing as he was on the threshold of a new and unexpected experience. He had not been of much account hitherto, with the master of Crump scarcely turned 30, but now he was everything. It was astonishing how simple he looked, and how little one knew of him. "I know," Christian answered, thinking of the rooks, and stopped. Not that it mattered, for the words reached neither of his companions. Looking from one to the other, he beheld the fingering of a great surprise. The face of the butler returned to him, and wondered suddenly what Slinkin Lindsay's death could have to say to his life. The silk whisper along the hall had something cruel in it, and again he looked at the window. An old keeper passing halted and spoke, and with a sense of relief he went out quickly into the bleak night. Doctor and lawyer exchanged glances. The former shrugged his shoulders ever so slightly. Then their eyes went back to the door. Alicia de Lindsay came in very composed, her hands and face very still. The day's tragedy had not softened by one whit the set line of her lips. You would never have guessed that she had laid her heart as a broken flower is laid on the breast of the Slinkin's hound upstairs. The lawyer drew forward a chair, and the doctor surreptitiously pushed a footstool, but neither looked at her for more than a second, and they did not look at all at the girl who followed behind. Deb entered with her head up, white but tranquil, in full command of herself, to all appearance almost unstirred. The lawyer ventured a chair in her direction also, and she took it with a brief word of thanks, folding her hands and looking straight in front of her. Mrs. Lindsay touched the bell and ordered tea, and there was a chilling pause, during which the two men stared uneasily at the carpet, while before the mother's hidden gaze was nothing but a slinking hound slipping away from her forever. "Where is Christian?" she asked at last, looking round. They told me he had arrived. There was no need in her voice, only desire for information. "He was here a moment ago," the doctor explained hurriedly. "Someone called him. I do not know where he went." She poured the tea with a steady hand. "He does not care, of course. His brother was nothing to him. His memory will be less than nothing." The words framed more command than interrogation, but the girl's quiet assent was not in the very least submissive acquiescent. Deb might be poor, might have lost everything she had hoped for in this world, but she was a Lindsay, meeting Lindsay upon equal terms, and the mistress of Crump knew it. "Christian will go with you. I will have him sent for," she went on. And almost as if he had heard, Christian appeared in the doorway. He shook hands with Deborah silently and rather shyly, for they had met but seldom since they were children, and then, still without speaking, laid a hand on his mother's shoulder and bent to kiss her. She started violently when he touched her, twisting her head and staring up into the fair, kind face, so near her own with an expression that made the onlookers catch their breath. And he withdrew his hand slowly, flushing as he stood away from her. "Sit down," she said coldly. "We can dispense with that sort of thing, you and I. Why were you not here to meet us?" "Old Brathay called me," he replied, taking a seat quietly, and handing Deborah a plate, which she refused with a gesture. "One of the puppies is ill. I ought to have been here, of course. I am sorry." "I suppose you know your brother has passed away," she went on, in the same lifeless tone. "You would not have cared to see him, I am aware, and he did not ask for you. But before he died, he gave us news of importance." "Of importance to me," Deb put in on her own account, with curious ease. "We were to have been married this year, as I believe you know, and now it seems he was married already." The elder men did look at her then, at the aloof face and straight, slim figure, with its loosely clasped hands, and from her to the rigid mother and Christian's dropped eyes. It was said the Lindsays always wore a mask. "That alters things," Christian observed thoughtfully, with no sign of perturbation in his quiet voice. "Slinker was always good at surprises. I suppose hounds are probably some other chaps now." "You need not be afraid," Mrs. Lindsay broke in sharply. "He married beneath him, one of those people who do not exist in the eyes of the government, but at least we are spared that." "He married a horse dealer's daughter," the lawyer explained hastily and uncomfortably. 3 years ago, a horse dealer's daughter in Witham. The father had been dead some time, and since she left her husband, she had been living with a married sister in Canada. Mr. Lindsay did not offer us any explanation of his extraordinary proceedings. "I used to know quite a human sort of horse dealer in Witham," said Christian. "Gave me rides when I was a youngster and told me tales by the hour. An interesting character in his way. And I remember he had an uncommonly nice daughter." He checked apologetically. "It's a very wild night." Deb laughed queerly and stood up, and Mrs. Lindsay rang and ordered the brougham. The departing guest did not offer her hostess a hand. "Goodbye," she said. "You will be glad to say goodbye. You have never been kind to me, and you will be pleased to be rid of me. We might have been friends, perhaps, for Stanley's sake, but it seems we are not to have the chance. You need not to be afraid that I shall ever trouble you again, though I shall not go away, as no doubt you expect. The county must get used to seeing me about as usual, and in time you'll forget that I still live at your gates. Be thankful things are no worse." Mrs. Lindsay's voice, grown suddenly strident, arrested her at the door. "Be thankful you have been spared what you deserve. You who have married my son for his property and his position, grasping at him with both hands, though caring no more for him than for his shadow on the wall." After the shocked hush, lawyer and doctor stood up simultaneously, saying "Madam" in the same breath. It was a poor attempt, and she ignored it. "You never cared. He was Lindsay of Crump to you, no more. Lindsay of Crump with his money and his name and his fine old place. The man was nothing to you, you miserable parasite on a proud old house. You would have married Christian here on the same terms, isn't that true? Answer me, can you deny it?" Doctor and lawyer made a desperate bid for the French widow, shocked to the depths of her ceremonious souls, but in spite of their haste, they could not escape Deb's voice, the voice of a prisoner at the bar. "It is true," she heard herself saying, facing the hard eyes of Slinker's mother, and then Christian slid a hand through her arm and drew her out. Old Brathay's in the kitchen with the puppy, worrying the cook out of her wits, he informed her, as they crossed the hall. "Let's go down to Kiln as quick as we can. I've always heard that your father was no end of a hand at the hounds." Footmen hurried them into wraps. An obsequious butler all but lifted them into the carriage. The lamps flashed a moment on the wide hall as the smooth wheels bore them away. Deb cast one glance at the dark pile of the house as they passed, then sat back silent. Crump blinds had dropped on more than a dead master. "It's an unforgiving sort of night," Christian said dreamily from his corner, as they rolled down the last of the avenue, the great trees clashing overhead. "On nights like this, I believe Westmorland breaks her heart for some old sin of long ago. She beats at the heavens, and they are brass. God does not hear. Brathay is like an old hen with hounds, isn't he?" She sat up, trying to see his face in the pale light over the river. "You must let me tell you," she said quickly and tensely. "I spoke the truth. I did not love your brother, but at least I loved no one else, and he was good to me." Christian nodded comprehendingly. "Slinker had his moments, I suppose," he said. "The rest of the time he was Slinker. I'm glad he was good to you." They plunged into the shadow of the bridge, where other maddened giants were at strife. The full tide had swung the river far up its banks, and they could hear the weir above the shout of the wind. Deb leaned back, a growing sense of quiet upon her. Christian's was a presence that asked nothing, took nothing, least of all sought for your miserable hidden secrets. He accepted you as you were, and in some utterly unreasoned way, made you feel that he was glad of you. She rested a little in his shadow. The carriage stopped at the near end of the village, by a creeped house backed by the hill, and faced by the river, and Deb in the road held out a firm hand. "You are not coming in," she said decidedly. "Brathay knows 100 times more about hounds than father. This is goodbye between me and Crump. You don't need telling that. You want to pat me on the head, and I won't have it, not with all the best intentions in the world. So say goodbye quickly and go, for there's quite sufficient anathema in store for me," without Clark adding that I kept his horses out in the rain. He dislodged her gently and opened the gate. Then he took the hand he had ignored. "Of course I can't come in if you won't have me," he said, "but you shan't always shut me out. Please remember me very kindly to Mr. Lindsay, and there's no goodbye between Kiln and Crump. You know that as well as I do." He dismissed the brougham at the turn to the stables, and walked up the steep incline until the avenue had swallowed him whole. Above him the knit branches rocked and wrestled as the wind tore at their crests. It was pitch dark under their swaying canopy. Now and then a sweep of rain caught him in the face round some monster trunk. He stood still in the narrow, sheathed road, looking up and thinking how strange it was that Slinker should be gone, and he himself in this place. It was hard luck on Slinker, he thought, to have been cast out of life so soon, and so sharply by the stroke of a whirling slate, to have sped his soul on a tempest night such as this. Slinker was the sort to have crept out of existence unnoticed, leaving the world uneasily doubtful that he might not reappear at any moment. The countryside had not christened him Slinkin Lindsay for nothing. Apart, however, from this touch of half-satiric sympathy, he felt little human sorrow for his half-brother. The bond between them had generally been strained to the snapping point of extreme dislike. He had 100 times more feeling for his young cousin, Lionel Lindsay of Areva, a mile or two over the river, on the far side of Cantacute. Slinker had been unbearable, always. Crump had meant nothing to him but the money it stood for, and the pleasure that ran with the money. He had often gloated over the amount of certain fairy woods represented, speculated lightly upon the price of certain farms that he was free to sell. Christian looked through the dark to where Dockernook, he knew, lay in the arm of the fell, and thought of the peril that came so near. He had been within an ace of sale, but it was saved now. Dixon of Dockernook, at least, would be glad that Slinker was no longer with us. Yet the county, always with a capital, had approved of Slinker. Slinker had always made a point of turning up at the right place in the right suit, with the right buttonhole. He knew what was due to his position, so Christian had been told often. Christian had been told himself that he was supposed to be deficient in this quality, so-called. Christian, home from college, had been the friend of the farmers, made a name in the wrestling ring, played football and ridden at the shows. Lakin Lindsay, they called him. The same clear-witted judges who had framed their delicate sobriquet for his brother. Slinker had merely sat on the grandstands and distributed prizes, clapped hands and crooked an arm for the principal lady present. No wonder the county had thought a lot of Slinker. He had been so careful about his conduct in public. Theirs was a race with a shadow on it, cursed and foredoomed, proud with age and old in pride. Their mother came of the Devonshire branch, and had early married Edgbert de Lindsay of Crump, who had died 2 years later, leaving William, his cousin and former heir, as guardian of his 6 weeks' child. Within 3 years, William had married the widow, and then Christian was born. Nominal owner for so long, William never had to face the humiliation of deposition, for he died a few months before Stanley came of age, little thinking that in 10 years' time the young man would have followed him to the grave. But now Stanley too was gone, and Christian and his mother were left in the old house to find what other mutual ground they might. She had always hated him, he reflected, almost unemotionally. The situation was too old for new pain. As an affectionate child, he had broken his heart over her attitude, but in the end he had come to accept it. Nor had his father shown much feeling towards him either. Occasionally, he had looked at him with whimsical eyes, as if meditating some advance, but his mother's presence had always stultified any growth of happy intimacy. He had been sent to school early, and William Lindsay, to whom life had given most things at second hand, except a certain bitter sense of humour, had been content to remain outside his child's heart, busying himself with ordering the estate of his supplanter. Yes, they had all worn masks, Christian thought. His father smilingly impersonal and aloof, his mother obstinately and apparently unreasonably cruel, he himself puzzled and hurt, but finally acquiescent, while as for Slinker, he laughed rather cynically. It would appear that Slinker had worn as many masks as a troop of mummers. At last the wind was dropping. He sauntered up to the top of the avenue and out by the top lodge beyond the trees, where a pale moon showed him in the land sinking in a vast watery hollow, and then rising again. He thought suddenly of Deb, and wondered how she had ever come to countenance Slinkin Lindsay. Deb was one of the Kiln Lindsays, a branch more remote from the parent stem than either that in Devonshire or Aravar, but in many ways closest of all. Kiln Lindsays had been Crump stewards for centuries, serving the fine estate from father to son with inherited and increasing devotion, which found in Roger, the last of the list, its most perfect expression, and alas, its culmination also. For Roger had no son to follow him, only a daughter, to whom the heritage could not pass. For 40 years he had set all his brain, his energy, and his love to the prospering of Crump, and under his hands it had touched its highest point of fortune. During Stanley's long minority he had nursed the estate like a tender living thing, backed by William Lindsay in all he did, and handing it over at last with the mingled anguish of pride and pain, which only those know who have given themselves wholeheartedly for what is not their own. He had wished to resign at the time, but Mrs. Lindsay had pressed him to remain in charge, pleading Stanley's youth and inexperience, and for 2 years longer he had stayed at his post. But he took badly to the new position, and the reaction of fulfilled work as well as the longer of old age was upon him, so that the end of the 2 years found the Crump agency gone from his branch forever. The wrench had been cruel at first, but now the peace of evening had reached him, and his mind dwelt chiefly in the past, and at least the old home was left to him. That had been one of the Slinker's few gracious acts in his short but singularly ungracious life. Sometime in his 53rd year, Roger Lindsay had withdrawn his attention momentarily from the estate, and married a Morton from Appleby, thrown by fate across his path on a visit, a quiet lady who had drifted gently into Kiln, and almost as imperceptibly out of it to her grave, on the High Fell side. So Deb had been a lonely little girl in a lonely house, a rather fierce, intensely reserved little girl, pure Lindsay and no Morton whatever, a strange little girl who loved the woods and silent places, and rarely made friends with anybody in her own station. She was bred in awe of Crump, and held aloof from the Lindsay boys in a mood that was half reverence and half resentment, though for Lionel, to whom these sentiments did not apply, she had her moments of kindly condescension. Her education was represented by a series of battles royal with inadequate daily governess until she was 13, when her solitary Morton aunt descended in wrath, and bore her south for 5 weary and interminable years. She had come back at last, however, polished and finished, a masked Lindsay as much as any of them. She had certainly been difficult to know, Christian reflected, looking back upon the 4 years since her return and his own college vacations. He had really seen very little of her, considering the tie between the 2 houses, and their near situation, and for the last 18 months he had been abroad, glad to escape from the atmosphere of his home, yet tortured always by the Lindsay longing for his own soil. He was in Japan when the news of the engagement reached him, and he had written a couple of congratulatory notes, wondered a little and let the matter pass. It was fairly easy to understand, after all, whatever you might think of Slinker. She was poor, probably ambitious, and Lindsay of Crump was the catch of the county, always with capitals. Any girl might have done it, he thought, in Japan. But tonight he had seen her with new eyes, and he wondered again. She had not looked that sort of girl, he reflected, not in the least the sort of girl to stand Slinker for a second after she had once really known him. Of course it was easy for him to sneer, to call her in question. The temptation was not lightly to be despised, a Lindsay not lightly to be said nay. If only it had been anybody but Slinker. Slinker's face rose before him with its pale blue gaze, colourless hair and smooth, guileless smile, and he frowned distressfully. Surely she must have shut the eyes out of her soul. He strolled back through the trees in the faint light filtering onto the muddy road at his feet. The striving arms were growing fitfully still. The land seemed to be curling itself into sleep with a tired sigh. He thought fancifully that his very passing had hushed it to rest. It had risen in storm for the flight of Slinker's spirit. For the new master it had sunk into peace. He spread his hands over it in a sort of benediction as he came out in front of the house. He would see that it was cherished. As he went up the steps, the first stroke of his passing bell came to him, across the desolate park and the troubled water, and he stood bareheaded while it told its tale of death, each long pause between the heavy notes fraught full with listening souls that had gone home on the same music. He shivered a little as he turned at last to the empty hall. His mother was upstairs. He did not need to ask where. The land was glad of him, but he wanted a more human touch than that. The place was so lonely and yet so full of ghosts. Even Slinker would have been better than nothing. But Slinker was dead, and Christian was Lindsay of Crump. Looking up at the eyeless windows, he wondered how long it would be before he came to lie where Slinker was lying, shot into eternity by family fate. The little station looked innocent enough, with its solitary platform and single line, its flower borders and toy buildings, innocent and sleepy, awaiting a tardy train, but to Deborah it was a veritable pillory as she stood by herself at its farthest extremity, looking westward to the sea. Market day in Witham was drawing its usual votaries in their various degrees, and for all Deborah was an object of interest as she turned an obstinate blue serge shoulder upon whisper and stare alike. She knew quite well they were talking about her. Each little knot of folk had something to say on the subject of her late engagement. It had been such an unexpected triumph, followed by an equally unexpected downfall. The peripety had been so abrupt, so recent, and the district was still gasping. Barely had it learned to look upon Deborah with a new respect when it found her, dumped back into the old obscurity, though reflecting perhaps a more subtle interest, lent by the atmosphere of scandal surrounding the whole affair. And that concludes tonight's reading. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this story, and I also hope that you're feeling a little tired. If you're not quite tired enough yet, you're always welcome to listen to another episode of the Bore You to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.